Welcome back, everyone. This is another episode of Strange Planet, and in this week's episode, we're going to be discussing addiction. Now, there are many forms of addiction, and we're also going to be discussing the question of whether or not addiction should be considered a disease. Now, throughout this episode, you're going to get our perspectives on whether or not we think it's a disease. And for everyone listening, feel free to leave a comment as to whether or not you think it's a disease as well. All right, so let us define addiction. Addiction is the state of being compulsively committed to a habit or practice or to something that is psychologically or physically habit-forming, as narcotics, to such an extent that its cessation causes severe trauma. What are things now that you could be addicted to? There's drugs, narcotics, alcohol, nicotine, porn, social media, and the list goes on and on. Now, the first thing to know is that you are not alone. And there are services out there that can help you with this. And the real first major step is acknowledging that there is a problem. Now, before I say any more, what do you guys think? Is addiction a disease?
I think that it's not so much a disease as it is maybe a part of being human, or maybe a modern day human. Because when I see, well, no, I think it's part of just being human in general. What is the outcome of addiction? It's serotonin, it's euphoria, it's getting that
Craving met.
it's getting that craving met, exactly, which brings you to that point of peace or serenity or happiness,
Right.
whatever it is. Well, most people are probably thinking, drugs, because that's a good way to do that. That's not the only thing. There is things like coffee and things like food and alcohol and even
Nicotine.
even going to church can be seen as something you can get addicted to, because there are people that are obsessed with stuff like that. You know what I'm saying? It's something people cling on to help them get that feeling of satisfaction and happiness. Now,
Well,
I think that is true for every human being. So I might disagree. I think it's not a disease, but more something built into the human, genome, into the code itself of what we are as a species.
hold on. Before we, decide whether it's a disease or not, let's sort of kind of define what a disease is and why, there, there can be a debate about whether to classify addiction as a disease or whether to classify it as sort of like a psychological or behavioral problem. So a disease, when you think of a disease, that's something that a disease is something that is like a biological or genetic origin. So like when you have, a disease like cancer or, heart disease or something like that, you think of things like, genetic risk factors for those things, your family history. You also think about your biology in terms of, what you're putting into your body and how your body's reacting to it. And those things can cause diseases or they can contribute to diseases, both the biological factors and the genetic factors. And so that's why when, people say that addiction is a disease, they mean that it's sort of like a brain disorder that has, biological and genetic factors. Something biological or genetic is causing people to become addicted to substances or addicted to whatever the addiction is. Alternatively, as I've said, it could be like a behavioral or a psychological thing. And then, there's sort of like a blending of the two, because you can't really think about behavior and psychology without thinking of biology and how that affects you. But there's, from a behavioral standpoint, you think more of like, the psychological factors and, social peer pressure or, stuff in the environment that creates addiction. Maybe they feel isolated or emotionally distraught, and so they turn to drugs to to combat, whatever emotional or psychological issue that they're dealing with. And so I think there's room for both components of it, both the genetic and biological components, which would tend toward disease, and also, the psychological and social and environmental aspects that you would associate with something that's not necessarily a disease, and more of like a behavioral problem. I think there's room for both. I think that the move toward treating addiction as a disease is more recent in terms of, recognizing the biological and genetic factors that may contribute to it. But there's also a problem in, I wouldn't say it's a problem, but there's also a concern that sort of treating it as a disease sort of removes personal responsibility from
Okay.
the matter, right? So like if you have a disease, like, oh, it's not my fault anymore. I can't do anything
Right.
about it.
I see where you're going.
And
Yep.
and so yeah, like a lot of people are trapped in this cycle of addiction. However, ultimately, absent, force, use of force like confining someone or, and monitoring someone, you're not really going to break that cycle of addiction. The person themselves has to.
Yeah, it's like that simple concept. You can bring a horse to water, but you can't make him drink, kind of thing.
Well, yeah, but sort of in reverse because in this
Right.
case, you don't want the horse to drink.
Yeah, right. Technically, right. Good
you
point.
you want to keep the horse away from the alcohol.
Right, right. Because, like, the real problem, too, though, which is where I can see the struggle, but in the end, you're right. There has to be that willpower, but you really, you do like the willpower not to do it. But you really,
Well,
with an
it's
addict, it's very hard for them to be able to do this. But some of this stuff that fuels the addictions, depending upon what they are, if it's not illegal, say it's something like caffeine or say it's like nicotine, I mean, there's that shit is everywhere, no matter where you are. So, like,
right.
that's
There's cell phone addiction, social media addiction,
right, right. But these
things that might
companies
not seem as damaging, but
are,
are both for people as individuals and for society as a whole.
because that's the other problem, though, because I see, and this isn't just an American thing, this is kind of like an overall global thing, I think, too. But it's like, I think a lot of these companies and places out there almost try to hook you on things. So it's almost like they want you to get addicted to their product because it puts money in their pocket. You know what I mean? They don't really care about what it does to you, just as long as, I mean, you don't die immediately and as long as they get paid. You know what I mean? So, like, technically, you could say, well, it's up to the consumer to know whether or not to buy something. But with an addict mentality, it's not that easy. You know what I mean? So they're taking advantage of the weaker, or I don't even want to say weaker because that's not the right word for it. But they're taking advantage of that mindset for, I mean, basically economic gain.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when like take video games for instance, we all like video games, and video games are an activity that can become addictive, and you can abuse video games. And certain games, like if you're a game developer, you sort of want to design your game mechanics to become to be fun and if not addictive. You want people to continue playing your game, not just because necessarily, I mean, obviously you're making the game as a developer to make money and to make people have fun and to give people a challenge. But there are also these forms of addiction that go into like microtransactions, which they try to induce you to become addicted to the cycle of quote unquote grinding for, XP or whatever you need to do to, you know, earn points or whatever to progress in the game. But then they also offer microtransactions to people who don't want to grind through that and to, they want to basically pay to win.
Right.
And so people who are addicted to those games will, in fact, pay to
Buy
win.
that. Yeah. Yep.
And they'll become addicted to buying it. Or, it doesn't even have to be in a pay to win scenario. It could be something like Fortnite with
The
various
skins and
different
shit.
skins, and you want to
Yeah.
show off your skin to your friends, and you want to have the latest and greatest skins and a variety of skins. And you can see how someone who sort of is addicted to social status would want to have the latest and greatest skins, if for no other reason than to show them off.
Basically.
So all addictions aren't the same. Some of them are really harmful, some of them not so harmful.
Right. So that one's a
But
little less harmful. Maybe not for your pocket, but
right.
yeah.
But there's some addictions that, I guess what you were trying to get at is that there's a lot of companies that prey on people's proclivity for addictions. And that's true. If you want to develop a product that is going to sustain someone's attention long term, especially in an era in which people's attention is waning and divided amongst a lot of things, you really have to do something to grab their attention. And creating sort of an addictive activity for someone to do will keep the consumer engaged in whatever platform that the company is selling their service or their product.
Right. See, my pet peeve, though, and my overall grudge with the whole concept of the economic gain part of this is when it starts affecting people's health. And maybe they're taking advantage of people that might not know better, or maybe they can't control it because they're already that deep in. Now, granted, there is therapy and there is things they can do. So it's not like they're just going to rot away. But if action isn't done, that could be an ultimate result, unlike the video game aspect and stuff like that. That's just going to pinch your
Right.
pocket. You know what I mean? So I feel like there's a certain level to where that is wrong. You know what I mean?
Right. But then you have to ask, whose responsibility is it at that point? Because there are some gamers who can play Fortnite and buy skins, and they're not necessarily, addicted to the purchase of skins. They like the variety of skins. They might purchase a skin once in a while, but they're not like compelled or addicted to doing it. There are other products or services that some people can use responsibly. So are you going to say to the company, no, you can't sell these things anymore, or you're responsible for checking whether your consumer is addicted to your product or service? I don't think that's feasible either.
That's true to a certain point, I guess, especially when it comes to the gaming aspect. But I feel like when it starts affecting health, that should be a red flag, though, and something should still kind of be done. Because think about it. When Coke first came out, it had cocaine in it. You know what I mean? So what did? They downgraded it to caffeine because caffeine won't kill you. Or
All right.
maybe not
I'm going to
quite,
jump
but
in here on this one. Coke was made with the coca leaves for flavoring, but they didn't realize that when they were processing it, that they were processing the part that cocaine is made from. They still use the coca leaves, but they've actually now filtered out all the cocaine aspect of it. So it's still flavored with that, believe it or not. But on the whole aspect of addiction when it comes to video games and what you guys have been talking about, you have to remember this country was built on farms of tobacco back in the day. That was one of the great crops that people were selling that made this country rich.
that is true.
So I mean that's ingrained from our history from square one. And addiction is goes back probably farther than we know. Just people didn't admit it or write it into any literature or history, but everyone had a vice. It seems there's always something that helps you get across that stressful moment. Those stressful. There is some coping mechanism. And it doesn't have to be like something you ingest or do with your body. It could be some people get crazy about exercise, or they
That's
just
true.
they have to hit the gym. They just have to hit the gym. They have to go on that run. They can't not do that with their day. Some people get obsessive. it's something built into the mental capacity of us as a human species,
Well,
finding a
yeah,
way to de-stress. But there is that aspect of taking advantage of people financially on that, and that's kind of what a lot of these companies do. I mean, why is there a Starbucks in every other corner? Because people
Right?
love their coffee, and it's not necessarily, a bad thing to have coffee, but everyone's addicted to it. And it's, some people can't even function without it. It's crazy.
Yeah, that's why like some of the stuff is harmful and some of the stuff I guess isn't harmful. You know what I mean? So there is a
well,
difference between the two.
well, I was going
But
to say to Mark's point that we, don't realize how far it goes back. Like, the some ancient cultures, like the ancient Egyptians had, alcohol addiction, and the Sumerians, who were like, you know, I guess like 3000 BC, they were, addicted to opium. So there's definitely, it's not just Americans, and it's not just modern society. It was a problem for humans, as long as we had civilization.
right. My problem with the whole thing is when it's something that's harmful for people that could kill them even, and it's a business structure around it. So then the argument that they'll always have is, oh well, they always have the choice whether or not to buy our product. Now, granted, they are correct for that, but at the same time, that same product has killed millions of people, especially if you're talking about tobacco. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Well, tobacco's like an easy target because it really has no benefit except to satisfy your addiction to tobacco.
It's the nicotine,
Well, yeah, I mean, it's to satisfy your addiction to cigarettes. That's pretty much the only benefit of a cigarette.
right?
There's no health benefits. There's
No,
just health
not at all.
detriment. And so, for a product like that, it's easy to say, well, it should just be banned or whatever. And of course, there would be people who will say, well, I don't care about the health risks. I know the health risks and I want to ingest it anyway. But then there's also other products that are, less overtly harmful. Alcohol, for instance, alcohol in moderation isn't really harmful. You know, it's if you abuse it to the point where you're, you know, drunk driving
Your
or
liver's
you're
in trouble.
right, or you're you drink until have health problems, then that's a different issue. But there are many people who just can drink it casually and they don't have a problem with it. And
And
if
they'll
you
be
were to
fine.
say, like, how do you regulate that, or how do we as a society, or even as a company, how they have you see commercials for Budweiser or whatever beer, saying drink responsibly. You know, what responsibility does a company have to ensure that its consumers are drinking
Right?
responsibly? Like, do they have to go and monitor every of one of their consumers' drinking habits and then not allow their product to be sold to them? I mean, I get that some products are harmful and they cause health problems or and other problems as well. We didn't talk yet about societal wide problems, I guess, yet, but it's really hard, I think, to come up with a solution where the company that's selling these products or services is either accountable or they're responsible for sort of policing the behavior of its consumers. I think that's a very difficult thing to request of a company without any very specific instruction. And I wonder what that type of specific instruction would look like, say, were there to be a solution.
I hear that, but I just feel like in the modern era and the way things are now, I don't really believe that any of these companies that are making any kind of product are making a product really for your own benefit. I really feel like they're all thriving on what can we get them addicted on and how can we do it. And it could be
Okay.
something like, you know what I mean?
So
Like it
then,
could,
so then, what's your solution then?
well, like I was saying, it could be something as simple as like a tobacco product. But then you could say, yeah, well, you're right. Well, this person smokes 6 packs a day and he'll probably die. But I only smoke 1 cigarette a day. So why can't I do that? So fair argument. I understand that. But then when you look at like social media aspects and stuff, that messes with their mental health. So when someone, the bottom line when it comes to addiction in general, one of like the biggest causes of it is stress. Whether something happened at work, whether something happened with a marriage, whether something happened with your girlfriend, there was, God forbid, a passing in the family. What is the result? They usually go to alcohol, or they'll go to drugs, or they'll go to, there's a crutch. It's
They
always
should go to therapy, and
that's
for
what they
that, you
should be.
check
Yeah,
out our last week's episode.
yeah, that's right. But like that's right. Therapy should be where they should go. But like they don't. A lot of people. So I feel like that's where these, company. This is where these products start coming in, and the companies themselves they don't really give a shit. You know what I mean? And it's all about
Well,
making
look,
the sale.
it's not necessarily that they don't give a shit. It's that they're in the business of selling products and services, and if they can figure out a way to induce people to buy those products and services, then they'll do so. And what I'm saying is that they will figure out any way to sell you that product or service. That's within legal, their legal capacity. And if that's to use design the product or service in a way that keeps you using it and perhaps makes some people addicted, then they'll do it.
Oh, of
As long
course.
as
That's what big pharma is for, if you think about it. The whole opioid crisis and all that nonsense. You know what I mean? You're not trying to tell me big pharma isn't cashing a nice check in on a lot of that. They're the ones making the products. A lot of people are dying, either that or the zombies. One of the two, or both. You know what I mean? And then if you look at it in the social media aspect, there's millions and millions of people that are on this, and they made sure it was free. Otherwise, you wouldn't sign up. But how many suicides?
I don't know that big pharma is profiting so much off of it now. I mean, fucking now you try to get pain medication. Like, I had oral surgery. They don't give you shit now because some people abuse fucking pain meds.
That's true too, but I think it also could matter where you are. Because I heard in Ohio, it's not quite like that. And there's parts of West Virginia. Actually, a friend of mine did a documentary on it, but that's more of the hard drug related. That's not as much big pharma. Although big pharma and a lot of those opioids is how they end up getting sucked into it. They'll start on that. You know what I mean? Then end up going to fucking heroin.
Opioids, and they can't get those opioids anymore, so they go to street drugs.
Yep. And then that's what ends up killing them in the end. You know what I mean? I feel like...
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, it's, I don't know that necessarily big pharma is profiting directly off of addiction. It's that they're, maybe in some respects, people may be over prescribing opioids, or that might have been the case like a few years back before people started paying attention to it. But now, it's all of these street drugs that have, sort of supplanted the pharmaceutical opioids that are the problem, because, you can't really, unless you have a really corrupt doctor, you can't get a prescription for those anymore.
That's kind of true. But at the same time, that's also what shows you what's kind of messed up with the whole, like, big pharma and the whole prescription thing in general. Because some doctors, like you said, the good ones probably won't unless there's a real, like, demand for it. or there's a real need for it. You know what I mean? But every time a doctor fills and signs his name and provides a prescription and a certain, drug to somebody, is it not true that they get paid for that?
No, it's not true.
Are you sure? Because I was told otherwise.
Absolutely. No.
You're 100% on that?
No, it's illegal to directly pay doctors for prescriptions. It's done in a more subtle way. And
what about the antidepressants and stuff like that? That works the same way?
Yeah, no. Doctors aren't paid directly, but what you do have is you have, and the industry has changed in the past, several years, but you have pharmaceutical sales and marketing teams going to doctors, trying to convince the doctors that these drugs are, the drugs that their company sells are the best for their patients. And, in the past, that involved, taking the doctors on trips or outings and lunches and dinners and, and then paying the doctors for speaking fees at events that are really just to, it's basically the pharmaceutical version of lobbying. You can't directly buy someone's influence, just like you can't directly buy someone's vote. But you can, treat the doctor very nicely and, I see that you prescribed, our drug to this many new patients. That's excellent. Would you like to come speak at our event in Hawaii next month? It's done, a lot more subtly, and especially now since the rules are a lot more strict. There's actually not as much of that out in the open anymore, at least.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't know that for a fact until just now.
So it's not like a doctor just whips out a pen, writes a prescription, and he gets a check from the company that makes it. That, at least in the modern era, doesn't happen at all and hasn't happened. But
that's good to hear.
What they do is they sort of lobby in softer ways to curry favor with doctors who, obviously have the power to write prescriptions. And this is the way that, it works in politics as well. You don't necessarily, like, politicians are, very, people think that, these companies are just buying politicians, or these lobbyists are buying politicians. That's too simple of an explanation as to what's happening. What they do is they do favors which involve like money for politicians or money and for staff. And it's not like in the form of direct money. It could be, lunches or trips or gifts or something like that. And it has to, as regulations have gotten tighter, it has to be done in more clever, I guess, ways. But at the end of the day, the politician and the doctor have the responsibility to take their, oath, whether it's the oath of office for politicians or the Hippocratic oath for doctors. They need to take their oaths seriously and do what's in the best interests of the country and the patient. And so, because actually there's like this distance between actually directly paying for influence, it actually allows the politician some sort of like, or the doctor some sort of leeway into sort of believing that, oh yeah, I'm independent, I'm not being bought. But you know what? I really like, I really believe what, this representative from the company is saying about this. So I'm going to hear them out. And over time, you just deal with these people over time, and you come to like, sort of rely on them and to trust what they say. And that's how it happens in politics. And that's also how it happens in the pharmaceutical industry. You develop relationships, and those relationships because the average person doesn't really talk to politicians every day, and the average person doesn't really have that influence over a doctor in terms of exchanging information. And so if you're in that special position to be able to talk to a politician or a doctor, then you're going to you know exert influence. And if you just happen to sort of financially benefit, not directly, but in terms of like gifts or things like lunches and things like that, you're going to influence the person's opinion.
But if they speak, obviously, like if they're trying to make a relationship with the doctor per se or whatnot, they'll probably comp the hotel. They'll do what they can. They'll throw the money in that department to try to reel them in a sense to keep the product alive. But they still get paid for the speech too, don't they?
Oh yeah, you can give a speaking fee, which is their compensation for speaking at an event. And of course there are definite tighter restrictions on that sort of stuff, but it's not and there's like some sort of maybe tacit understanding, at least in some circles, that if you perform poorly as a doctor in terms of not prescribing a certain level of or a certain amount of prescriptions for that particular drug, then maybe they won't, ask you to speak as often.
Which makes sense, I guess, but it matters who the doctor is in that case.
Right.
Because there's a big chance the drug might not be that good, but the doctor wants to get paid. So he may just bullshit it.
Well, I
you know what I mean?
I don't think the doctors like overtly say, you know what, this drug, it's just not as good. But you know what, I have to prescribe like, it's 2 or 3 patients this month, just to, keep the pharmaceutical rep happy. I don't think it happens like that.
I would hope not.
It's more like this, pharmaceutical representative, I've, established a relationship with them. And, they tell me all these good things about their drug. And you know what? I tend to believe them because, I have this relationship with them. It's just like anyone that you have a relationship with and you talk to over time, you come to trust the things that they say, more than someone that you don't talk to. And they come to influence your mind in terms of, whether you're biased toward a certain product or service or not. So, like a doctor, like, if you've been hearing about this drug from a pharmaceutical rep for a long time, and the pharmaceutical rep comes and they can, if there's like a study that shows that it's not as effective, they can be like, oh, but wait, this study wasn't done correctly, and this is the reasons why. And you tend to like trust that person's reasons more than you would normally if you didn't have that pharmaceutical rep there. So it happens, in more subtle ways. It's not like the doctor is out there being like, you know what, I don't think this drug is the best, but I'm going to prescribe it anyway. Most doctors, I believe, don't do that. There's some probably greedy bastards, just like in any profession.
Right, and that's the problem.
Vast majority of doctors, can be influenced in more subtle ways, and I think that's really what you have to focus on. Just like in terms of politicians, there's probably a lot of really good politicians, but they don't realize that they're influenced in subtle ways, or they may realize it at various degrees. But I think that the more our society and people understand that that's the way, that's how lobbying works. It's not like an outright, egregious thing that can be easily identified. It's the establishment of personal relationships over time, and human, like the influence of someone over someone's biases toward or against something. that's how it operates. And I think the more that people understand that, the more you can constructively talk about, solutions for this.
I mean, I don't think we're ever going to get rid of addiction and, all forms whatsoever. I mean, we can try to crack down on things with substances like, alcohol or marijuana or even stuff more potent like, harder drugs. But I mean, we're never going to crack down on the things that aren't, I don't like you guys said overtly like harmful to people, or at least not in the shortcomings. I don't know. Look at the necessity of gas in this country. We are gas dependent, almost like we are addicted to gas. We can't just move to something else. But it's maybe that's fact that's all we know, or just we don't know better. If you think about it, when we did have those cash crops back in the day with you know tobacco leaves and everything, we didn't know that that was harmful to us. We just know that it kind of made us feel a little good.
Yeah,
So
on the contrary, actually, they used to think it was okay and it was actually good for you back in like
yeah,
the 10 20s, and back in then you could smoke in
mm,
hospitals, you could smoke in airplanes. It was actually like supposedly meant to improve your health. They would even bullshit to you sometimes, believe it or not. And then science and death showed you otherwise. But as far as the gas thing you said, is the reason why we can't shift to other things. That's going to lead to another whole conversation. But that's basically just the oil companies not wanting to, worrying about losing their revenue towards new, you know, energy sources that they're not doing. Maybe some of them are, but yet we have not officially shifted over yet. But I do also agree with what you said about addiction never being really fully resolved, because
Well,
there's a lot of things that play into that. And it does
yeah,
really come down to the individual in the end. But the temptation of not even just this country, I mean, it's mostly the whole planet's got this problem when it comes to basic stuff like alcohol and tobacco and stuff. But like, as long as that stuff is always there and right over the counter and so accessible, this is always going to be a thing. You know what I mean? So that's what therapy and like I was going to say family, but sometimes that's not always the option. It's not always the best option. But it's an individual problem, but just know that you're not alone, but there is help available, so you don't have to think, you know what I mean, you're trapped in a bottom of a well or something. You know what I mean? There is things you can do, but at the same time, you have to want to change yourself in order to get the results you want. You know what
well,
I mean?
in order to want to change yourself, you have to have self-awareness of your problem or your addiction.
Right.
That, even to develop, that well. And, in terms of getting rid of addiction, it's pretty much a part of not just human nature, but, biological nature. I
Yeah.
mean, animals can become addicted to things. So it's at a, as to whether it's a disease or not. I believe that it can be viewed as a disease, that it's genetic and biologically. Humans and other animals are engineered to, you know become addicted to substances, primarily because their drive to, either avoid pain or to
Stress.
gain pleasure. It's at that very psychological, instinctual nature to avoid pain and to receive pleasure or to get pleasure. Humans and other animals are engineered to do that. And if there are things in the environment that provide the avoidance of pain or the inducement of pleasure, then those environmental stimuli will be pursued. And according to your genetics and other biological factors and your social experiences and everything, all that adds into, whether or not you are a candidate for addiction.
That is true.
And ultimately, yeah, it is your responsibility to manage your entrance into addiction. But that's not to say that there, we should definitely have programs to help people identify and deal with addictions effectively. If you have friends that are addicted, by all means, try to help them out and to help them, get help for their addiction. Because sometimes when people are so wrapped up in addiction, they can't, see a way out, or they can't, recognize their own addiction, their problem. And so it can be helpful if you can reach out to them, stage an intervention, and, help them get help, which it may be easier said than done, because an addiction is an intensely personal. I say this as someone who was addicted to cigarettes. you know Getting me, like, you couldn't force me to quit cigarettes. That was something that I had to decide for myself. You can suggest all the help and threaten with adverse health conditions, and you can do all of that, but at the end of the day, it is a decision that you have to make for yourself. And hopefully, the environment around you is one in which can be supportive of you when you want to get help, and to when you want to break the cycle of addiction.
Right. And that's why, most importantly, too, even besides that, is make sure you're there. If you have a family member, if it's a friend, regardless to who the person is, by you being there means more to them than you realize, too. You know what I mean? They don't feel isolated. Right. They don't feel stranded. However, there will be times they're going to combat what you say, and you might bump heads. You know what I mean? Because some addicts, they can be stubborn too, and they don't want to be told this, and they might not even think they have a problem. And like Rook was saying before, that's the first step to addiction, to acknowledge that you have a problem. You know what I mean? There's an addiction here. And if you can do that, then that's the first step. And then the next step is, what are we going to do about it? You know what I mean? And then that's right. When you take sometimes you got to take small steps. You can't just, like, some people just can't quit it cold turkey. But, I mean, some of these things, they don't happen overnight. So you have to, it's something you got to work at. You know what I mean? And even if it's not you, if you're like representing someone that is going through this, you're there as an aid. You're there to help out and encourage. You know what I mean? Try to keep that positive mindset that they can get rid of this and better their lives. And that's all the time we have for this week. We hope this episode has been beneficial to anybody out there that might be going through addiction, and we will be revisiting this topic in the future. Strange Planet will have new episodes on YouTube every Friday. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next week.